Hello everyone and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. Today we're looking at how fire impacts Oklahoma's landscape and how you can effectively use controlled burning to help manage and maintain your land. It's all part of a new educational video produced by our colleague, Craig Woods.
What we see today is not how it's always been.
The Oklahoma landscape before settlement was wide open prairie in most cases. Now, where soils were coarse textured, precipitation high, those would be forest. But that landscape, in fact, at settlement was open forest. And we might refer to that as an open woodland or savanna even.
At one time in Oklahoma, cowboys drove cattle on the Shawnee Trail through these forests. And Native Americans standing on the prairies could see from horizon to horizon.
Before Europeans settled here, the prairies and forests were controlled by fire.
The trees tell the story. Fires burn through the prairies and forests and shrublands every few years. Fire was part of Oklahoma.
Most all the native plant communities in Oklahoma are adapted to fire.
Native Americans use fire to improve hunting, make traveling across the countryside easier, and even as a defense against their enemies. They managed the land with fire.
Historic accounts of Oklahoma talk about Native American use of fire, and it was very important in their daily lives.
When a lot of people have the misconception that it's unnatural if people burn, well, it's quite unnatural if people don't burn because lightning set very few fires.
By controlling the frequency of fire and season of the burn, landowners can return to a historic Oklahoma while meeting their needs for the land.
Fire is very beneficial whether you're only interested in wildlife or you're only interested in livestock or you're just interested in the aesthetic beauty of the land. Fire gets it back to what it historically used to look like.
The western part of the state that receives the least amount of rain is mostly shrubland composed largely of sand sagebrush and shinnery oak. In eastern Oklahoma, forests grow because there is more precipitation, and grasslands cover the central part of the state. This is how it has been for thousands of years.
You can manipulate the plant community with a disturbance like fire, but only within the bounds that the climate and the soils will allow for that site.
A landscape that has not seen fire for many years will have a buildup of understory brush, woody plants, and litter. Like mulch in a garden, the old growth keeps new plants from sprouting. Given enough time, woody plants will eventually dominate the landscape, not only in the forest, but the prairies and shrublands as well.
On the large scale, without fire, and over a period of time, let's say 5 to 10 years, we will see a successional change to a different growth form of plant. In just a few years, we can actually see, without fire, a conversion of prairie to a red cedar woodland.
Grasses require a lot of sunlight, and if you have an overstory of woody plants, grass abundance is going to decline on a site.
A fire uses the litter as fuel and knocks down taller woody plants, exposing the soil to the sun.
Sunlight is critical in this equation.
There is more solar radiation or sunlight that meets the surface. In the short term, that means warmer soil, and plants grow back very rapidly in the spring when the soil is warmer. There simply is not such a thing as a fire that's so intense that the soil is sterilized or plants are killed. They are there and they will come back.
The first plants to grow are annual forbs, a good source of food for wildlife and even cattle.
If a landowner is primarily interested in cattle production, then they would want to be burning fairly frequently, probably every couple years.
Cattle are attracted to the new growth because it is highly palatable. But grazing on recently burned areas can also help profitability.
Using a fire does several things from a cattle production standpoint. Probably the most important is that you get a rapid tillering of new grass from the root, and these grasses are very high in crude protein.
Well, stocker cattle producers in the Flint Hills and Osage County of Oklahoma have known for years and years that annual burning is a great boon to the stocker industry. You can expect a 10 to 15% increase in cattle gain just from fire.
What we've seen here in Stillwater is going from somewhere 4 to 6% crude protein all the way up to 16 to 18% crude protein following a fire.
Just better quality, just like nutrition for any animal.
Also, when you burn, you remove a lot of the old plant material. So it makes it more efficient for cattle to get at that new growth. There's not as much of the old growth that's less nutritious for them to have to dig through. Even though the tops of the grasses are burned away, the roots remain intact, and that'll keep soil from eroding when you have precipitation.
During the first year, the grasses will resprout from these roots. Most woody plants will begin growing shortly thereafter. One of the biggest benefits with fire is that it is an inexpensive way to control eastern red cedar.
These plants, when they're top killed by a fire, they rapidly resprout. Really, the notable exception to that rule is the eastern red cedar, which is a fire-intolerant woody plant. If it's top killed by a fire, it has to come back from a seed source.
And woody plants that do return are grazable by animals, including livestock, during the first year.
When you start using prescribed fire on the landscape, you'll see that cattle diet and wildlife diet is much broader than you typically would have imagined it to be. So fire really changes what plants animals consume, and it makes a lot more plants available to wildlife and cattle.
As these same woody plants mature, they provide habitat for deer.
Native Americans burned because they understood what we're just beginning to learn, that it attracts animals to an area. The most recently burned areas, they were able to hunt.
If you're trying to manage for white-tailed deer, they're browsers, so they like a lot of woody plants and vines. So about a 4-year fire frequency in this part of the country is about appropriate, whereas quail, you'd want to burn them a little more frequently.
If left unburned, woody plants will again cover the landscape and the abundance of grasses and forbs will decline.
Okay, fire frequency, you have to think of that in the context of a landscape, knowing that any given acre that burned will benefit some species and not others. So it's not perfect for any animal at any given time, but you rotate that fire across a ranch or across a landscape, and so animals shift their habitat use based on fire frequency.
While frequency is the most important aspect of using fire, season of the burn is also a valuable tool. Most burns in Oklahoma are done in March during the dormant growing season.
March being the windiest month in Oklahoma, it's difficult to find good, safe conditions to burn under. So spreading out your burn season over different periods of the year can give landowners more opportunities to burn, but also can bring different benefits to the land and to their management goals and objectives.
New growth after a fire is more nutritious than older grasses. Summer burns can provide low-cost food plots later in the season.
A lot of times during late summer, the nutritional content, a lot of the grasses and stuff are declining rapidly.
We found that you can burn in the summertime, like in July, and extend that high forage quality right into through the late summer and the fall.
We can peak those nutritional quality of those plants back up to just like it was back in the spring when we burned in the spring months.
Summer burns also have the advantage of usually being less intense and easier to control because the plants are actively growing.
Even during the summer months, things may look really green, but again, if you got enough litter, old growth vegetation left, that areas will burn. That stuff will burn. Just because it's green, don't think it won't burn.
Landowners of forest areas have another option. They also can consider a burn after leaf fall.
Right after it falls in November, December, the fuels aren't compacted down because of snow or rain. Leaves are fluffy, they're dried out, there's a whole lot of them, and things burn a whole lot better.
The most important thing to remember is to be patient with any burn.
We've seen now through many years of research in Oklahoma and elsewhere as these rangelands are adapted to fire in any season and any condition, and so all we have to do is wait.
Fire allows Oklahoma landowners to work with the land, not against it. And because the land is adapted to fire, It is a sustainable way to manage the land.
One of the valuable things about using prescribed fire is that you're not eliminating future options. Shinnery oak being a good example. If you eliminate it with a herbicide, it's off that site. It will not be there again in your lifetime. You can manipulate it with fire and still have that, depending on if your objectives change or if you decide to sell that land and the purchaser wants it for different reasons.
Because there's nothing that mimics fire that we can do as a management tool. Mowing does not mimic fire. Mechanically cutting cedar trees does not mimic fire. Chemicals or herbicides do not mimic fire. Fire is part of the system and nothing mimics what it does on our landscape.
Fire has a positive effect on the landscape of Oklahoma.
Hi, I'm Al Sutherland with your Mesonet Weather Report. Well, we start out the year in such better shape with our soil moisture across the state. A map of 10-inch soil moisture shows that only 2 sites, Fort Cobb at 0.1 and Weber Falls at 0.2, come in dry on our scale of soil moisture. This is a scale of 0 at dry, 1 at wet, and you can see all those dark green areas across the state indicating good moist soils. Taking a look at a graph that shows the rainfall in 4 sequences, January, March, April, June, July, September, and October, December, we take a look at 2010, that's the blue, 2011, that's the red, and then the green shows normal. And we can see how back in 2010, things were pretty close to normal until we got to October, December, and then they came in at only 4.5 inches for that time period. Going back then to 2011, January and March, 4 inches below normal for a statewide average. April and June come in again below average. July, September, way below average at 4.6 inches of rainfall statewide. And then October, December, a big bump in rainfall, 9.5 inches for the state. Gary, what can we look forward to as we begin 2012?
Thanks, Al, and welcome to 2012, everybody. Since we haven't been on for a while, I thought we'd start with a look at the U.S. Drought Monitor map. Now, I'm afraid it's the same old map. This map was released on January 5th of 2012, and we still have basically the western half of the state covered in mostly extreme drought, but a little bit exceptional drought still holds on out there in the western Oklahoma Panhandle. And then for the eastern half of the state, a little bit of moderate to severe drought, and then completely out of drought over in far east central Oklahoma and the southeastern portions of the state. Now, if we take a look ahead using the U.S. Seasonal Drought Outlook from the National Weather Service's Climate Prediction Center, we see that drought is expected to persist or intensify through basically the western half of the state. The outlook for precipitation from the Climate Prediction Center for January shows an increased chance of above normal precipitation through the eastern part of the state and an increased chance of below normal precipitation in the far western parts of the state in the Oklahoma Panhandle. I look at the temperature outlook from the Climate Prediction Center for January. We see much of the central part of the United States, including Oklahoma, has an increased chance of above normal temperatures. We've seen a very warm period already through December, and January looks to continue that warm period. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
Wheat and corn prices are up, and the USDA will release crop estimates next week. Joining us now is Kim Anderson, our grain marketing specialist. And Kim, let's start with this price increase.
Well, I think it's strictly because of the funds are getting back in the market, higher corn prices, and then of course dryness in Argentina. That's having also some positive impact on corn and wheat prices.
Now, the wheat harvest has wrapped up in Argentina and Australia. How did everything look there?
I think it's coming about as expected. The report that comes out next week, they'll probably lower Australia's wheat production a little bit. Argentina will probably get about an average crop around 550 million bushels. Australia's crop, I believe, will remain at a record, but less than it was projected last month.
And in looking at crop conditions around here, kind of what's the latest? How are things looking in the region?
Well, they're really looking good. It's amazing. You know, you look at some of the numbers on those crop conditions, 63% of Oklahoma's wheat crops good to excellent. Only 7% is poor to very poor. 37% of it's being grazed compared to 34% last year and a 35% average. Who would have thought that, you know, last September, October. Texas, as we know, the crop's in relatively bad condition with 25% good to excellent and 38% poor to very poor. A Kansas crop, not quite as good as Oklahoma, of course more of it there, 53% good to excellent and 9% poor to very poor.
Okay, let's talk now about the USDA report that's going to be released on January 12th, which, by the way, it will be in honor of my mom's birthday. What kind of things are we going to expect to see?
Well, there's 4 big reports coming out then. You got the annual crop production reports, which is the final numbers. You've got the grain stocks, the WASDE report, and the winter seedings.
Okay, and any pre-release estimates there that you're looking at?
Yeah, I've seen Allendale's numbers and heard a few. They're looking at about 2.2 million more acres of winter wheat, hard-ridden winter wheat, up 1.3 million acres.
Okay, and then what kind of things are you going to keep an eye on in the next week?
Well, I'm watching that Kansas City Board of Trade March contract. It's above $7 or right at it. I think it's going to stay between $6.50 and $7, but that report on Thursday is going to determine where prices go.
Okay, we'll see you next week. Kim Anderson, thank you.
Many years ago, a rancher in Canada, his name was Gus Conefal, he decided that he had observed that if he changed the feeding pattern of the cows during the course of the winter before calving began, that he saw a change in when those cows actually delivered the calves. In other words, he thought he saw that if he changed his feeding from daytime to late afternoon, early evening hours, that he had more calves actually come in daylight hours. Well, he told his local university about it, and they did a study. And with 104 cows way back in the 1970s, they found if they changed the feeding from a morning feeding to an evening feeding, they went from about 38% of the cows calving during daylight to 79% of the cows calving in daylight hours, and that's quite an advantage. Here at Oklahoma State University, we made the same change a number of years ago and saw a similar shift in the calving pattern. When we put out the big round bales and the supplement at dusk, we had over 70% of the calves born between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. The biggest study to date that I know of concerning this topic was done in Iowa, where they had over 1,500 head of cows on several different farms, made that same kind of a change from a morning feeding to a late afternoon feeding, and they had a dramatic shift going from about a 50-50 calving in the daytime, nighttime, to 15% of the calves coming in the nighttime, 85% of the calves coming during daylight hours. So yes, I'm a believer in this concept of late afternoon, evening feeding in order to encourage more calves to come during the daylight hours when we have a better chance to be there and assist that cow if she needs some help. That calf is going to be born at a warmer time of day, and quite frankly, I think we'll have a little higher survival rate of the calves, and that's so important as these calf prices continue to climb. So let's try nighttime feeding this year and see if we can save just a few more calves. And I look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
Continuing now on the topic of fire effects in Oklahoma, we're looking at grassland and shrubland issues.
When most people think of the Great Plains, they think of wide open prairies. But these prairies are a result of frequent fire. If this important ecological process is not allowed to function, the prairies will disappear. Grassland untreated by fire will soon become dominated by woody plants such as elm, persimmon, Osage orange, and most of all, eastern red cedar. The woody plants shade out traditional prairie grasses and displace many of the native wildlife species. Eventually, the land becomes an eastern red cedar woodland. Eastern red cedar is a native tree to Oklahoma, but fire has kept it under control. Eastern red cedar, unlike most other woody plants that occur in the Great Plains, does not resprout from the root or stump when the top of the tree is killed. Prescribed fire is the most practical and economical way to manage it.
The main thing on controlling red cedar is you have to have enough fuel to get them to burn. So the smaller trees, 5 or 6 feet tall and smaller, are usually controlled with a normal prescribed fire.
Here is drawing down into the creek bottom.
Research has shown that 98% of eastern red cedar trees under a foot tall can be killed by prescribed fire.
When red cedar get larger, they're harder to control with the kinds of burns we use, just simply because there's not enough heat generated by the herbaceous fuels under those trees. But now if we have a wildfire under extreme conditions, you'll see the really big cedars burn up also.
Fire frequency is the key. Landowners can use multiple burns over multiple years to kill larger cedars and keep seedling trees from establishing. The initial burns will allow grass to grow underneath the larger trees, fueling fires in the following years. Even if they do not crown out or become totally engulfed in flames, the heat from the fire can still kill eastern red cedars. In the year after a fire, the forb or broadleaf plant composition of the grassland increases. This is due to the increase in bare ground and the ability of annual forbs to take advantage of this disturbance. As grasses again become dominant, these annual forbs will decline. The increase in forbs, plant palatability, and nutritional quality on recently burned areas are beneficial to livestock, but also attract certain wildlife species. After a fire, plants such as buckbrush, which are not highly preferred by wildlife or livestock, become more palatable. Most of these plants are also kept shorter in height by fire and are more accessible to browsing animals.
What we're seeing here is a reflection of successional processes that over time has created a dominance by, we call the big four grasses in tallgrass prairie: big bluestem, little bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. This particular pasture has been burned repeatedly in late winter. We're now in late spring, and we see that we still have the dominance of those late successional grasses. One in particular that I think is interesting to note is this grass here, little bluestem. As you can see here, it has responded very well to this fire. Regrowth is quite normal, and we expect, in fact, a full forage growth year this year, even with a winter burn.
Research has shown that burning little bluestem and other grasses at any time of year, including growing season burns, causes virtually no mortality. Landowners might think little bluestem was destroyed by fire because the center portion of the crown is dead. But this is the normal growth pattern for this grass. The center of the plant dies back, and the new growth occurs along the edges of the crown. Fire increases both above and below ground growth on this important grass. The Great Plains not only consist of grasses, but in some areas shrubs are abundant. While there are many species present, sand shinnery oak and sand sagebrush are two primary shrubs in the southern Great Plains. In the past, they were kept short in stature by frequent fire.
Shinnery historically was documented as a dwarf oak species that rarely got above shin high. Again, thus the name shinnery. Now, in that part of Oklahoma, and most of that shinnery is waist high or higher.
These taller woody plants shade out the grasses and forbs, making the land less productive for livestock and many wildlife species.
If we put fire back in that system, we can reduce the stature of that shinnery, allow a lot of the understory plants, the grasses, to come back up and to be intermixed with it.
An interesting aspect of woody plants in the Great Plains is the vast majority of them resprout following fire. And this is really evident with shrubs. So you don't kill these plants typically with fire, you just kill the top of the plant, but from the roots they resprout rapidly.
This sand shinnery oak has been burned every 5 years in the dormant season. The longer fire return interval allows the shinnery to regrow and establish as a dominant plant in the overstory. This site has a 2-year fire frequency, which benefits the grasses and other herbaceous plants and reduces the shinnery to an understory shrub.
So if you're trying to have a site that's dominated by grasses, you can do that with frequent fire in a shrubland. If you're trying to have a site that has a lot of forbs, usually the year or two after a fire, you'll have a lot more forbs on that site before the woody plants become to dominate that site again.
The time since fire and fire frequency are the key factors in determining the plant community.
And again, even here in the shrubs and shrubland type communities, fire frequency is the most important, because at the time when you quit burning, in a short period right after that, they're all going to come back and they're going to be just like it hadn't been burned before.
Other shrubs such as sandplum and sumac are also adapted to fire. These plants form clumps or mottes, providing a habitat for bobwhite quail. Landowners are often concerned that frequent fires will destroy these shrub thickets, making the area less suitable for wildlife species that require shrubs.
However, one thing you should consider is the size of the shrub thicket and also how much fuel or grass is inside or under the understory of those shrub thickets. Because often, particularly if it's a large shrub clone or thicket, the fire won't carry all the way through. You might remove the first couple of meters of shrubs and then they'll resprout, so you don't kill it, but you will change the structure, but the interior will often remain untouched by the fire.
Fire is not a one-time shot. So again, if you're planning on using fire as one time and getting something done, it's not going to happen. It's all about fire frequency.
To learn more about using prescribed fire to help meet your land management goals, just contact your local OSU County Extension educator. That does it for us this week. Remember, you can always see our stories anytime at sunup.okstate.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Lyndall Stout. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see you next time at SUNUP.